Okay, the interpretation of quantum mechanics has always gone hand in hand with the realism, anti-realism debate. Here's Bohr and Einstein. And that presents a kind of dilemma, right? Anti-realism can be accused of ducking crucial explanatory questions. Why do quantum systems behave the way they do? Don't ask, says Feynman, right? Realism provides us with plenty of explanatory options, collapse theories, Bohmian theories, Everettian theories, but they compete with each other. We got underdetermination, they have unpleasant features, as we just heard about, right? So isn't there a third way? Okay, so recently Richard Healy has proposed such a third way in his book and in a series of articles, right? And that's the pragmatist way. And here's the idea. Read the interpretation of quantum mechanics of its use. Right? How do we use quantum states? Well, here's how we use them. We use them via the Born rule to recommend probabilities for non-quantum claims. Right? That is, the role of quantum states is prescriptive rather than descriptive. Okay, here's his favorite example. It's buckyball interference, interference using C60 molecules. Right? Let's just zoom in on the top right of that diagram. Right? Each incoming molecule is assigned a quantum state, a plane wave. The quantum state is time evolved through the apparatus, producing an interference pattern at the target. Right? But this time evolution of the quantum state is not to be understood as a description of the progress of a physical wave through space. Right? Instead, the state is used to infer the right degree of belief you should have in the molecule sticks to the target at this location. Okay. So is this just instrumentalism then? Well, no, because the location of the C60 molecule isn't an observable thing, right? It's not something directly observable, right? The theory isn't just giving you probabilities for experience, right? It isn't a recipe for predicting our experience. Rather, it advises us on the proper credence to attach to what Healy calls non-quantum magnitude claims. Okay, so that's a brief, where non-quantum magnitude claims, I'll call them classical claims. Healy objects to that terminology. We can talk about why if you like. That's a very brief sketch of Healy's approach. Here's how he thinks it deals with foundational problems, again, very briefly, right? How do we deal with the measurement problem? Well, the quantum state isn't a representation of the system, so there's no physical collapse to account for, right? A measurement just gives an observer some information, and that explains perfectly adequately why the post-measurement observer should use an updated quantum state in making further inferences. Okay, so there's a nice, straightforward solution to the measurement problem in Healy's pragmatist approach. He also thinks that it gives a solution to the non-locality problem for non-relativistic quantum mechanics. Namely that he insists that observers in different spatial locations should use different quantum states in making their inferences. Alice should update her quantum state based on her measurement result. But this doesn't mean that Bob should instantly update his quantum state. He's space-like separated from Alice, right? In this way, he thinks physical non-locality is avoided. I'll come back to these claims later, but that's a very brief sketch of Healy's position on the foundations of quantum mechanics. Now I want to move on with some problems that have been attributed to Healy's approach by David Wallace and by me. And the problems, one way of locating the origin of these problems is that Healy adopts a local form of pragmatism. I call it local pragmatism following a recent paper by this guy, Tanner Layton. Like Bohr, Healy seems to rely on a distinction between quantum and classical. Right? Quantum claims prescribe credences in classical claims. What do the classical claims do? Well, whatever we always thought they do. They describe the world. Right? Only the former gain their content by the inferences they license. So that's why Leighton says Healy adopts a local pragmatism. Right? Okay, so with that background, here's three different objections to Healy's approach. Two from Wallace and one from me. The first one, right? Wallace says, look, this quantum classical distinction is just untenable, right? Classical systems are just limiting cases of quantum systems. That is, the distinction, the quantum classical distinction is drawn in terms of quantum processes, right? Healy draws it in terms of decoherence, which is a quantum process, right? So Wallace insists we need to understand quantum claims representationally to understand the quantum classical distinction at all. Okay. Wallace's second line of objection has to do with quantum language. Much of what we say, what physicists say about quantum systems, can't be understood in Healy's terms, says Wallace. Right? Healy's model is we understand quantum claims in terms of the probabilities that they attach to classical claims. But we don't understand laser in terms of probabilities attached to classical claims. Right? We understand it in terms of the quantum mechanism inside the device, the amplification via stimulated emission of radiation. Right? Similarly, Wallace says for theoretical claims, right? That's for empirical claims, but even theoretical claims like theoretical terms like quark-gluon plasma, Wallace insists that we can't understand those except in terms of the dynamics of the quantum system. So we have to understand the dynamics of the quantum system representationally if we're going to understand what a laser is and what a quark-gluon plasma is. Okay. Third objection, this one I made a few years ago, is that Healy's approach can't account for physicists' practice, which is an embarrassment in an approach that is intended to be driven by practice. Right? So, for example, it's true that physicists derive probabilities for classical claims via the Born rule. Yeah, they do that all the time. But they also describe features of quantum systems prior to decoherence and without recourse to the Born rule. Right? So for example, in Healy's favorite experiment by Uthman et al. In 2009, they describe using a home-built helical velocity selector, there it is, right? So that all the transmitted particles arrive at the same speed. Right, so they're quite happy to describe this velocity selector and describe the particles passing through it and to make sure that the ones that pass through are all going the same speed. And those are all claims about particles prior to decoherence. Right? Okay. So there's three problems for Healy's approach. Here's three strategies for solving those problems. Wallace says, what we need to do is Healy relies on a quantum classical distinction. That's untenable. So we need to reject the quantum classical distinction, and we need to treat all claims representationally, not just the classical claims, but all claims, right, including the quantum claims. Give up on this pragmatist approach. Tanner Leighton, in a recent paper, attempts to defend the quantum classical distinction that Healy relies on so that we can make sense of a local pragmatism that treats only classical claims representationally. Here's what I want to explore, which I hope is more in line with what Healy intended. Let's reject the quantum classical distinction and treat all claims inferentially. That is, instead of adopting a local pragmatism, adopt a global pragmatism. Okay, that's the strategy I want to briefly defend today. Right? You might think, it's just as an initial objection, look, we can't treat all claims inferentially. Healy says the content of a quantum claim lies in its prescription of credences for classical claims. Yeah, but if the credences for if the content of classical claims lies in credences for yet further claims, aren't we stuck in a regress? And this is a problem that's been raised for all kinds of global pragmatism, and the response is a standard one. Yeah, it's a regress, but it's not a vicious one, right? Gert in 2003 says, look, there's no exit from the system of inferences, but we don't need an exit from the system of inferences. The content of a claim is its inference for other claims, and so on ad infinitum. Regress, but not a vicious one. Okay. There's certainly, it's easy to motivate Healy's particular brand of pragmatism, right? Because the inferences that connect quantum claims to classical claims can be summarized in this super neat little rule, right? The Born rule, right? From the quantum state at the target, we can infer the probability of the molecule hits the target at location X using the Born rule, and we're done, right? If we want to say that the classical claim itself, you know, that the C60 molecule is at a particular location on the target, if we want to say that the content of that claim is also given inferentially, we don't have a nice neat rule that we can say, here's how that content is given. There's going to be a bunch of rules and heuristics, right? Well, the content is given by inferences to what we might see if we scan the target using an electron microscope. It's going to be given by inferences about the increased mass of the target if we were to weigh it very carefully, and so on and so forth. Right? But that doesn't mean that the claim can't be understood inferentially. It's just that the inferences are going to be complicated and messy. I don't take that to be a serious objection. Okay. So, suppose we run with this proposal and see how we might resolve the objections that I raised earlier in terms of a more global form of pragmatism. Right? So I'm going to take them in reverse order. Right? My third objection, the third objection I considered was that Healy's approach can't account for physicists' practice. Right? And my suggestion for responding to that worry is, look, let's just give up thinking that there's a class of quantum statements that's connected to a class of classical statements via the Born rule, right? Then we open up considering a much wider range of inferences. It's not just that the only inference rule we're allowed is the Born rule, right? So, for example, think about the claim, the velocity selector produces particles with the same speed. That's in the paper. Right? That claim has a function. And we can describe the function of that claim in terms of the inference it licenses. The inference that the authors of the paper wanted to license is, look, so we're justified in ascribing a particular quantum state to these particles, right? Because they all have the same speed, we can use a plane wave with a precise momentum to model these particles, right? Maybe we could cite the eigenstate eigenvalue link as the relevant inference rule there, right? The particles have the same speed, gains content, and it gains its content via an inference to some further claim. Okay. Now there's danger in this. I mean, there's a reason why Healy wants to resist saying claims about pre-decoherence quantum states have content. Why? Well, if we ascribe a speed to each molecule, can't we also say that each molecule has a location? If we do that, we might conclude that each passes through one slit in the grating, and that would rule out interference, right? We get mistaken inferences if we infer that the particles have precise locations as well as precise speeds, right? So Healy says we should withhold saying that claims about pre-decoherence quantum systems have any content whatsoever, right? I want to say, no, they have some content, right? We can say that the molecules have the same speed has content. Right? How do we avoid that danger? Well, we got another set of rules that's going to block the problematic inferences, right? Namely the commutation rate relations. To the extent that a molecule has a well-defined speed, it lacks a well-defined position. So, given that inference rule, the physicists are going to say, yeah, so all the molecules, we've arranged for them to all have the same speed, but now we can't say anything about their position, right? Because we've constrained their momentum. Right? Okay. So that's a proposal for resolving the third objection. What about the second one? The second one is that novel quantum language, language that's introduced in purely quantum terms, can't be understood in Healy's terms, that always goes via the classical. Okay. My diagnosis is that Healy tends to treat quantum systems like a black box that spits out Born probabilities. Right? But if we adopt a global inferential pragmatism, we don't have to treat quantum states like a black box. We can grant them a much richer inferential content. Right? So here's what I have in mind. Wallace in 2020 paper gives an extended analysis of the quark-gluon plasma. Right? And here's just part of it. Hot systems are described most naturally in terms of quarks, colder systems in terms of protons and neutrons. And here's the punchline. I have not the faintest idea how to make sense of any of this without taking the quantum state of the QCD system and its dynamical evolution under the Schrödinger equation as representational. Right? So it gives a long account of the physics of quark-gluon plasmas and then says, and you can't understand what I just said unless you take the quantum state and its dynamical evolution as representation. Okay. Wallace says, don't ask whether the system is really made up of quarks or protons. It's really a quantum state, a wave function whose dynamical behavior depends on temperature. That's what it really is. Okay. Here's an alternative way of looking at things, which I take is more pragmatist friendly. Well, the inferences you can reliably draw about quantum systems depend on the temperature. So it's appropriate to use quark language at one temperature, and it's appropriate to use proton and neutron language at another temperature, because using that language allows you to draw the correct inferences in either case. Okay. And this doesn't require reifying the quantum state. Right? So the idea is that we can adopt an inferentialist account of the quantum systems themselves. Right? Even prior to decoherence, some inferences are going to be warranted about quark-gluon plasmas, and you can do that without having to think that the quantum state represents is some kind of picture of the world. Right? Okay. The first objection I considered, the worry is that Healy's quantum classical distinction is untenable. Right? The obvious reply is that a global pragmatism is going to take the content of all claims to be inferential, right? So there's going to be no reliance on the quantum classical distinction. Then we can understand decoherence in terms of the distinctive inferences that are licensed by systems that have interacted with their environment, right? We can give an account of decoherence itself in pragmatist terms. If a system has interacted with its environment, then it's going to license a richer array of inferences than a system that has not interacted with its environment. So global pragmatism allows us to understand the process underlying the quantum classical transition, which Healy treats as kind of a black box. Right? So it's a quantum process. Quantum processes just spit out Born probabilities. Don't ask anything more about them. The present proposal is, no, we can attribute richer content to quantum systems than that richer content can, I hope, allow us to understand the decoherence process and hence understand the quantum classical transition. Okay. So, 10, thank you. Let me come back to the foundational problems of quantum mechanics again. Healy insists in an interference experiment, we can't say anything about the molecules before they stick to the target. We got a quantum state, but all that is a thing that licenses inferences to probabilities of the target, probabilities about post-decoherence systems. I've tried to make the case that we can say various things about the molecules before they stick to the target. The obvious worry here is that, yeah, but then the quantum state is representational after all. I mean, it's not the kind of pictorial, dynamical representation that Wallace is after, but still you can say some things truly about these molecules before they hit the target. For example, they're all traveling the same speed, right? Does that reintroduce the measurement problem, right? My hopeful answer is no. I think that we can make the case that decoherence is doing all the work. Here's what I have in mind. Before decoherence, if we ascribe a location to a molecule, yeah, sure, they've all got the same speed. But if I say this one is right here, right, then that results in mistaken inferences, right? If I say that each molecule has a precise location, then I'm going to say that each one goes through precisely one slit, and I'm going to rule out interferences, and that's wrong. After decoherence, once these buckyballs have stuck to the target, it's perfectly fine to say that each of them has a precise location. I'm not going to make any mistaken inferences from the assertion that a molecule has a precise location. At that stage, we can ascribe probabilities to the locations via the Born rule, right? And the probabilities are going to exhibit interference. So no appeal to measurement as such is required in this story, right? And we don't have to assume that the pre-decoherence state has no representational content. It has a more limited representational content than the post-decoherence state. So we can appeal to decoherence. Decoherence is a nice physical process. We don't have to appeal to measurement as such, so the measurement problem doesn't rear its ugly head. Okay. What about non-locality? Recall that Healy says that quantum states attach to space-time locations. So there's a quantum state appropriate to Alice's location, and there's a quantum state appropriate to Bob's location. Right? And because quantum states are relative to space-time locations, then no physical non-locality is required to explain the correlations between entangled particles. Right? Okay. I'm not particularly convinced by Healy's position here. Right? Here's why. It looks to me like Bob's particle acquires a spin when Alice makes her measurement, even though Bob is far away. Does this require non-local action? I think it does. Healy insists that, well, Bob shouldn't update his state assignment, right? Because he has a separate one and he's over there. He shouldn't update his state assignment. Sure, right? But Alice should update her state assignment, and Alice's state assignment is partially about what's going on over at Bob's location. So Alice now, she makes a measurement. She knows what's going on space-like separated. She has, she can make reliable predictions about Bob's measurement outcome. Okay. So relativizing states to space-time locations solves one kind of non-locality, but I'm not sure it makes the non-locality problem go away. Healy insists that there's no physical non-locality, right? But there is inferential non-locality. Alice can make correct inferences about Bob's distant result, and she could do so, instantly. From an inferentialist perspective, it seems like this is what physical non-locality looks like. What does it mean if you're an inferentialist to say that Bob's particle is spin down? Well, I can infer things about what Bob's going to see when he measures the spin of the particle. I can infer that he will get spin down, and that inference is not going to fail, right? I don't think Healy claims that his pragmatism addresses quantum non-locality, but I'm not really sure that it does. Nor does my global version, right? So this is just to say that I think there are limits to the power of a pragmatist approach, and one of those limits is I don't think it touches quantum non-locality. But we shall see. So, in conclusion, Healy's pragmatism relies on the quantum classical divide, and that's a problematic foundation. My suggestion is we can improve on Healy's pragmatism by adopting a global pragmatism. The content of all claims lies in the inferences they license, not just quantum claims. Right? The difference between quantum claims and classical claims is just going to lie in the nature of the inferences and the kind of rules that the inferences obey. This allows us to understand novel quantum vocabulary because we can broaden the set of rules that we can use to apply to quantum systems beyond just the Born rule. And it allows us to make sense of the way physicists talk when they talk about the properties of pre-decoherence particles. How does this globalized approach do with respect to quantum foundations? My claim is that it does no worse than Healy's approach. If Healy's approach is a solution to the measurement problem, then a globalized version is also a solution to the measurement problem. Does a globalized approach address quantum non-locality? No, I don't think it does, but I think neither does Healy's. So here I just say, well, we've reached the limits of what pragmatism can do for us. Okay, thank you. There's the references. Oh, yeah.
Comments by you, Art? Yeah. All right. Thanks to Peter for this really stimulating paper. I obviously have a lot to say about it. Don't worry, I won't go through all this. I know we're anxious to go have a beer. And mostly, I'm going to put on my Richard Healy hat and just try to defend him. I shaved my mustache, unfortunately. Okay, so the first point is that business about the quantum classical distinction. So Lewis, and drawing on others here too, says that Healy draws this distinction. When it comes to the inferentialism, I think Healy, at least the way I understand his view, he doesn't think that inferentialism is limited to the quantum domain. So I guess I'll read this quote here. He says, concepts of classical physics, of the rest of science and daily life all get their content from how they help to determine the inferential role of statements in which they figure. I have a picture of his book here because if you look at the title of the book, the main title is The Quantum Revolution in Philosophy. But if you look really closely under that, there's a shadow that says The Quantum Revelation in Philosophy. And the reason it's a revelation is it's supposed to, I have a quote under there, teach us what we should have already known from just paying attention in philosophy class, namely that things like pragmatism and inferentialism are true. We should have already known that. Quantum mechanics reinforces it. So I think he's on board with global inferentialism about meaning, and in fact, I think it's really important for one of the roles of quantum theory that I'll come to. Now, quantum statements are a source of disagreement here. He's definitely clear that they are non-representational, even in a kind of inferentialist way. But I think the problem or the disagreement between you, Wallace, and others in Healy is smaller than it may seem at first. Because for Healy, what counts as a quantum statement is very limited. It's basically only claims about the quantum state. The way he puts it is quantum theory doesn't have any variables. It doesn't have any entities that it introduces. Now you might think, well, there's all these things. There's the quark-gluon plasma, there's the Higgs field, there's quantum fields. He actually thinks all those things are non-quantum. All those statements, I should say, are non-quantum. Why is that? Well, because those are things that you apply quantum theory to. You assign a quantum state to those things. So you assume them, he calls them assumables, but you don't posit them on the basis of the quantum state, and there's nothing in the quantum state that represents them. So if you just look at kind of the extension of claims that he says are non-representational, it's going to be very few. Most of the things that you and Wallace want to talk about, he's going to say you can talk about. Sure, he's going to call them non-quantum, which kind of strains what we count as non-quantum, but that's mostly a verbal thing, I think. Okay, so the more substantive worry, I think, or disagreement, I should say, between you and Healy, I think concerns this idea of empirical significance. So for Healy, we have these magnitude claims that are all non-quantum, even though they might seem pretty quantum. But the only ones that we can ascribe Born rule credences to. So in other words, the only ones quantum mechanics can inform our credences about are the ones with empirical significance. And what is the type of empirical significance? Well, a necessary condition is that it appears in the context of decoherence. And this is exactly for the reason you mentioned, that if you try to say, you know, if you ask quantum mechanics, how confident should I be that the particle or the buckyball went through one slit rather than the other? Quantum mechanics says, well, you better not draw any inferences about that, or you're going to get into trouble. You're going to end up, with disjunctions in which neither disjunct is true and stuff like that. So don't talk about claims like that outside the context of decoherence. Okay, right, because it's unreliable. Okay, so I take it one big difference between what you want to do and what Healy wants to do is you want to allow for inferences in non-decoherent contexts. So we can talk about what happens between the source and the detector in a two-slit experiment. Healy says you're better off not doing that because the content, this is where the content is important, that it's all inferential, because for him, the content of the claim the particle went through slit A is actually meaningless, or what's the term he used here, not sufficiently well-defined, because you can't reliably draw inferences from it. So quantum mechanics told us that, we wouldn't have expected it, and that's an important role. Okay, the problem, first, your idea is to add other inferences in, I'm trying to go quick, add other inferences in besides just credences about statements that occur in the context of decoherence. My worry with that, and you yourself flag this as a potential worry, is that then we're playing the quantum interpretation game again, just in a different guise, namely, what inferences are licensed by the quantum state description? And there's going to be big debates about that. You mentioned the eigenstate-eigenvalue link. That is a very substantive interpretive claim about what's going on. Arguably, it would lead you to non-classical logic in the context of the two-slit experiment. The other problem is, yes, non-locality, as you also mentioned. So my problems are just your problems. But I do think Healy can solve the non-locality problem. But as I say here, I think it comes at a cost. So the way I think Healy solves the non-locality problem, and he's made this more clear in newer work, is by recognizing that, okay, something's only meaningful if it occurs in the context of decoherence. What is decoherence? Well, it's a process of quantum state evolution. Quantum state doesn't represent anything, and it's relative to agents. So decoherence also is not a physical process. It doesn't represent anything. And it's relative to agents. So that's the key bit, being relative to agents. So if we take like a standard EPRB scenario, Alice, I have this on here, you can work through the details if you want, but if Alice measures her particle in the x direction and she gets x up, she's going to update her quantum state so that she now knows, she's going to update her quantum state so that the quantum state of Bob's particle is x down, or superposition of z. But only meaningful sentences concern her particle. She can meaningfully say, my particle is spin down, but she can't even say that Bob gets a result, and she can't even ask quantum mechanics to give her credence about Bob's result, because that's not in her decoherence environment. Her decoherence environment is limited to her forward light cone. Now, what she can say is that when I find out when I get together with Bob and ask him what he got, I can expect that he's going to tell me a certain result, because that is in her decoherence environment. So quantum mechanics can guide her credence about that, but it can't tell her anything about Bob's result at space-like separation. And yes, you could talk about either them getting together or there being another observer at the intersection of their light cones there at 3. Now the problem, there's a big cost to this. So I think it solves non-locality because Bob doesn't even have a measurement result at separation according to Alice. But the big cost is just that measurement results become relative to agents and decoherence environments. So Healy endorses this. Wigner doesn't have a measurement result. According to Wigner, their friend doesn't have a measurement result. According to their friend, they do. And those are just both true. He embraces this result, but it's a pretty radical result. And in fact, he just says the only reason this isn't so bad is because when it comes to our evidence for quantum mechanics, we all share the decoherence environment. So I don't know, that was a lot of, my attempt at responding on behalf of Healy. So thanks again.
Okay, I think I counted 4 points there, so let me run through them very quickly. First point, isn't Healy already totally on board with the global pragmatism? Yeah, maybe. Maybe this is a much friendlier amendment than I take it to be, right? There's some stuff he says at the end of his book where he sounds, the quote you put on your handout, where he sounds totally like a global pragmatist, right? But on the other hand, there's all that stuff in the early, most of the book is about, there's quantum claims and there's non-quantum magnitude claims, and we have to treat them very separately, right? It's hard to tell. So maybe he'd just say, that's what I already said, in which case, fine. Second point, you say, quantum states are a problem, but Healy has a very limited notion of what a quantum state is. Quantum statements are a problem, but Healy has a very limited notion of what a quantum statement is. So, for example, you could have a statement about a quark-gluon plasma that is a non-quantum statement, right? I think that's right. So that's not the problem. I think the problem will be more to do with explanation, right? So Wallace insists Healy can't give us any explanation of what a laser is, because what a laser is this mechanism that goes on inside the cavity. Right? And Healy's going to say we should say nothing about what's going on inside the cavity. So I do think there's still a problem there, and it has to do with explanation, not entities as such. Empirical significance, right? Okay, so I say, let's add more inference rules than just the Born rule. You say, does that reintroduce the game of interpreting quantum mechanics? Yeah, I think it does. I mean, Healy, I think you're right about that, and maybe Healy would be sort of unhappy with the direction I'm taking, because he might think it's gonna reintroduce all those realist debates just under a pragmatist guise. Right? I think there's something right about that, but I hope at least that a pragmatist orientation will give us a new way of assessing debates about the interpretation of quantum mechanics, such that some issues fall away, or some positions just look untenable, right? Bohmian mechanics, for example, might just look untenable from a pragmatist perspective. And so that's kind of a promissory note, but that's kind of the way I hope it will go. Your last point about non-locality, you say, so what Alice can say, she can only say stuff about her own decoherence context, right? So Alice can say, I got spin up, but she can't say, so Bob got spin down, right? Because Alice and Bob are in separate decoherence environments. There are 2 points I want to make about that. The first is, it's kind of funny conceptually, as you sort of mentioned. You know, Alice can reliably and perfectly predict Bob's result, but she can't say that Bob got a result, right? Why can't she say it, right? This is supposed to be pragmatism, right? So that puzzles me. The other thing, I mean, which is just a technical question that someone in the room can probably answer in a couple of sentences. Can we say that Alice and Bob occupy distinct decoherence environments if they share an entangled particle? Share a pair of entangled particles. I mean, there's something, you know, decoherence is all about what's correlated with what. And Alice's particle is correlated with Bob's particle. So that's just a technical question that I don't know the answer to. Okay, but yeah, thank you.
Anything? Okay, we should start or not? Okay. Okay. Okay, perfect. Chris, yeah.
Sorry for the clapping in the wrong time, but thank you again for the talk. I really enjoyed it, and thank you, David, for the comments. So maybe you can, it's a very general issue, and maybe you can help me understand this. I was reading, thanks to David, this bit of the book. So it says quantum theory is revolutionary because, not because it represents new and unfamiliar physical things, and then blah, 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 or processes and blah, blah, blah. Then your way of reconstructing is pragmatism, and I totally agree with the bits about non-locality, both what you said now in response to David and what you said during your talk. You allow for non-locality, or at least you're saying
it's a problem.
It's a problem. So you're saying I have to accept it because I don't like his reply, and I agree with you. But then I guess I wonder about the motivation for pragmatism, because, like, in my understanding, at least part of this motivation and part of the motivation of the people that are representationalists about the quantum state in ways that I sometimes understand not too much, is to say something about non-locality, which is not simply admit that there is such a thing. Now, you are admitting that there is such a thing, but you're going pragmatist. So I guess what's the core motivation for going pragmatist then? Is it like just under determination of the various approaches? Is it?
Yeah, I mean, so if your whole motivation to going pragmatist was as a way to solve non-locality, then I'm suggesting that shouldn't be your motivation. But then I'm friendly to the pragmatists about approach, but then why? I don't think it solves that problem. Well, I think responding to underdetermination is a big part of that. just thinking in general philosophy of science terms, right? If you think that the worries that Ben Carson raises about underdetermination and realism are serious worries, then pragmatism, a pragmatist approach might look attractive because it might dissolve some of those underdetermination worries. Although, as I just said in response to David, I'm not sure exactly how far it goes in dissolving underdetermination worries. Another motivation might just be because he's become convinced for independent reasons that pragmatism is the right way to understand any kind of theoretical
That would have nothing to do with quantum mechanics.
Nothing to do with quantum mechanics. It's like, start with moral language and then just expand until you got moral language. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, that was very thought-provoking. So I think my question has been partially already addressed by our exchange with David. But so I was curious about the extent of the global inferentialism or pragmatism. So I just wondered if what you intended is that here the philosophy of science, philosophy of mechanics has a bearing to the extent that it has impact on like all areas of philosophy, be it like philosophy of logic and language, so the pragmatist/inferentialist framework should be applied in there as well. I wonder if this kind of global lesson is also intended in your proposal.
Which you can clarify that the global lesson.
Yes, I just was reminding me of, because I had partial work in some philosophy of logic and in language, so inferential was like, the good old Robert Brandon kind of stuff and all these kind of stuff. I just wonder if that was also a part of your considered upshot in you.
Yeah. Well, it's more like an analogy. I think. It's like Blackburn comes along and says, "Look, there are moral values in the world. That's weird, but we can understand morals more pragmatically." And then folks like Keith Rice come along and say, "Yeah, there's nothing special about morals. Right? We can just expand that to understand all our life." So I was just copying, basically. Healy, at least at the beginning of his book, seems to have quite a narrow focus kind of pragmatism. Claims about quantum states that purely prescriptive. But wait a minute, all claims are purely prescriptive, right? If you take the history from Blackburn to Price as a model, then you might do the same here, just kind of exploring that. So it wasn't so much that I see that as an upshot, as well, that's the kind of model that I was thinking like inspiration from.
Thanks. Thanks for a really interesting talk. So right at the beginning, you started by sort of talking about the realism and anti-realism debate, and then pivoted into the sort of inferentialist direction. And it seemed as though there was a suggestion that by being a pragmatist, you're thereby being an anti-realist. But it seems like there are a lot of live avenues available for someone who wants to be, for example, an inferentialist and also maintain sort of a full-blooded scientific realist position. So like sort of Ian Hacking's kind of entity realism kind of view, like the sorts of entities who are warranted in admitting to our ontology, the ones that by admitting to our ontology we're able to make good inferences about certain things, like by spraying electrons I can come to know about quarks and so on. So do you think of what you're doing as kind of being orthogonal to the realism debate, or do you have a particular attitude to which side of this is supposed to fall on?
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have started to talk that way, because Healy certainly says he's a realist. Right? So I really, the beef that Healy has, I think, is not all realism is representational realism. You don't have to think, if you're a realist, then any piece of math that you have out there corresponds more or less pictorially to something in the world. It's like, no, that's not the right way to think of the matter in quantum mechanics. You should think of it descriptively, right? You want to say it's a descriptive thing. Some of what he says sounds kind of instrumentalist, right? Don't ask what's going on inside the interference device. Just ask what probabilities it suggests for things you can observe. So there are clearly, he says he's a realist, but he also says some things that sound instrumentalist. I still haven't fully gotten my head around to what extent the pragmatist approach is genuinely realist, to what extent it tends towards instrumentalism, to what extent it just, maybe a hope, Hannah Lakin, who I mentioned, thinks this way, is a Carnappian hope that you can kind of make realism, anti-realism just sort of go away. It's like, well, if we understand things in terms of the inferences you can make, right, and then you re-ask the realist question, right? So does this really represent the world? What question are you asking precisely? It represents the world in just the way I told you. You can make direct inferences from this piece of math. So I don't know if that answers your question. But it's kind of, it's complicated, I think, for sure.
Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, this is related to some of these previous questions. Maybe I'm interested in the phase variables and in particular the explanation of some hypothesis. So, I'm understanding Healy doesn't want quantum variables,
Right.
Just pragmatism. By the pragmatism, you're giving up variables at every level. So we just have kind of invariables instead of variables coming all the way up.
Right.
And then there's a class of explanations that Healy has access to, which you don't, which is that, like, at least at a classical level, we can explain why some inferences are good in terms of how the world is. So was that just kind of a mistaken inference pattern that we can do without? Or is there some way to kind of recapture that kind of inference is good because of how the world is pattern in the global picture?
I think that was always an illusion. That's my sense, that inferences are good because of how the world is. What do you mean how the world is? Well, what you mean by how the world is, well, if I assume the world's this way, then I make the right inferences, right? So I think that was my gut reaction is to say that form of explanation is always an illusion at all levels.
Okay, we still have time for some questions, comments? Okay, good. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.